It's hard to answer this question quickly because actually that decision was a long time in the making. Since I'm at home, I will say that this is a book that I was given when I was 7 years old, all about us, and it basically debunks race as having any such thing as an inferior race or a superior race, including the idea of how absurd and silly it would be if everybody looked alike. So it is a child's introduction to human diversity, and it was profoundly important for me. I must have read it hundreds of times. My brothers and I would read it to each other. So there was a very clear-cut effort by my parents to make me think in an expansive way about our world and to make me feel empowered as somebody who could do something about it. When I got to Ohio Wesleyan University, the sit-ins started while I was a student there. So in a sense, if you want to pinpoint the moment when I made the decision, it was when the news reports first flashed on February 1st, 1960, about the sit-ins. And I immediately began to work at Ohio Wesleyan on organizing a student group called the Student Committee on Race Relations. It grew and it expanded, and sometimes we would have 200 people attend the meetings, and we raised money to help the sit-ins. But I was already engaged while I was still a university student. And in my senior year, I took a trip with faculty and students affiliated with the campus YWCA, which was the place if you were a student interested in public affairs. That's where you would go on campus. We took a trip to Nashville, Atlanta, and Tuskegee, and that is where I met Julian Bond in Atlanta at that time in my senior year. But just to say also that in my family background, people don't normally think about white families being abolitionist families in the South. But I come from a very long genealogy of Methodist ministers in Virginia and North Carolina. And they were all, so far as I can tell from the stories that came to me through my father, very much concerned about race. And so there was a conscientization process that was underway because my family roots go back to the 17th century in Virginia and North Carolina. And I think that I think that my decision was inchoate. It was emerging. It was there. It was present. And it took the sit-ins to have a discernible effect on me, such as I want to do something specific. And then what I decided to do, because I did not know how to go to work for the organization that grew out of the sit-ins, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee called SNCC, I decided to go to graduate school either at Emory or Tulane just to get myself into the Deep South, from which I would make my way into SNCC somehow, and I did not know how. However, after returning from the trip to Ohio Wesleyan, I was sitting in the bus station waiting for the bus to take me home when a phone call came saying that Miss Ella Baker and Professor Howard Zinn would like to interview you. Would you be willing to fly to North Carolina to be interviewed? And I said yes. And then I called my parents and said, I'm not coming home. I'm flying to North Carolina. Because I've been invited to by some of the people that I met on the trip in my senior year. And so I did meet Miss Baker and Howard Zinn. And I began working with them on a project called a Human Relations Project that was paid for by the Marshall Field Foundation. The concept that Miss Baker had worked out with the campus-wide, the National Student YWCA, and a black woman social worker named Rosetta Gardner, was that there would be a pairing of a white woman and a black woman to travel together to campuses to talk about race. In point of fact, we could not do that in 1962. It was impossible. There was only one university in the South that would have me and my partner, Bobby Yancey, who is now very senior at the Schomburg Center in New York. Bobby and I could not travel anywhere except to Chapel Hill. I could go with her to the black colleges, but she could not go with me. So we changed the plan a bit. However, the point is, we were not really talking about race. I was not talking about race when I was on white campuses, because you couldn't get invited onto a campus if that's what you wanted to talk about. I was talking about academic freedom, which was a kind of rubric under which you could begin to broach subjects like the fact that the cost of bearing two systems of education was a very, very heavy burden for states that were already very poor in educational accomplishment. And so we did the best that we could. However, the point was of our work to identify likely or interested students across the South who would like to come to a human relations workshop with Ella Baker and Howard Zinn. And then Bobby and I were also playing a role in the running of those workshops, so we ran workshops all over the South. Meanwhile, on weekends, or any time I had a spare day, I was working at the SNCC office. So throughout that year, starting in approximately the summer of 1962, summer of 1962 through approximately the following year, summer 1963. While working on the Human Relations Project, I was also working in the SNCC office as a volunteer. That's when I would have met Julian the second time. After the trip that I had taken that introduced me to him in Atlanta in June 1962. I know you're interested in what my reactions were to him. I thought him extremely urbane for someone so young, and one of the most polished people that I had ever met. I was intrigued by the way he phrased things, by his phraseology, the way he talked, the way he expressed himself. I'm very interested in words, so it attracted me because he might not ever make a sentence like that, I'm interested in words, but as obviously he is interested in communication, in expression, in words, and so on. So that appealed to me immediately.
Dr. Bourne, do you want to tell us about how you first met Julian and what your initial impressions of him were, and give us a little bit of an idea of how you got involved in the Atlanta sit-in movement?
I came to Atlanta when I was 17, and I came from the UK, and I, to a modest degree, was subjected to a certain amount of discrimination in the South myself, merely because my background was different from the Southerners around me. I also was immediately disturbed by the fact that there were no black students at Emory, no black faculty. There was no contact between Emory University, which was all white, and the Atlanta University Center, which was all black. It was in the aftermath, of course, of the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision. So there was a kind of unspoken momentum in terms of civil rights. The ambience was the need to move civil rights forward. And I think perhaps one of the things later on that really convinced me to put as much effort into this issue as I did was that in medical school in our junior year we were allowed to work on black patients, but it wasn't until we were in our senior year that we were allowed to move up and work on white patients. And I thought, this can't be right. This is a dreadful situation. with a small group of like-minded students at Emory. We decided in 1960 to reach out to the growing student movement at the Atlanta University system, and we invited 6 of those students, African American students, probably the first who had ever been on the Emory campus, to come to Emory, and we had a 2-hour meeting to which we invited any Emory students who wanted to come. And about 30 showed up, and they just talked and answered questions about the nascent student movement, both in Atlanta and elsewhere in the country. Julian Bond was one of those 6 students, and the other 5 were all went on to become very distinguished figures in their own right. I and everybody else there, as was almost always the case, hit it off immediately with Julian. He was so affable, easy to get along with. He was, as Mary said, so urbane and well informed and well read and well spoken. And for students at Emory, the white students, most of whom had never met a black person who wasn't in a totally subservient role as a janitor or a domestic, they were stunned by Julian and indeed by the other students as well. We then decided to start joint communications between the 2 institutions. We supported the Atlanta sit-in movement in 1960, and then when the students at Atlanta University, led by those 6, put out an appeal for equal treatment that was published in the New York Times and the Washington Post, we issued a statement published in the student newspaper at Emory, strongly supporting what they had done, and the statement, the content of this statement.
What was the response of Emory to the university's or the students' decision to publish and support the appeal?
It was interesting. There were quite a lot of academic faculty members who were very supportive. Quite a lot of them weren't from the South. Quite a lot of them, or all of them, were very well educated, sophisticated people. And they didn't want to jeopardize their standing in the university. But they were quite happy to say to me, you know, you have my support, and if you need some money, I'd be happy to contribute. And then there was the university administration that was adamantly against what we were doing and called us all in and had originally refused to give us a room even to meet in. And their attitude was that this was going to not only damage the reputation of the university, but it put in jeopardy the tax-free status of the university, which from their perspective was probably a legitimate concern, because the legislature was only too happy to threaten to take away the tax-free status of any educational organization that sought to foster integration.
But I had been volunteering on
Right.
weekends and
Right.
working on days off and any spare time that I could get. So I knew everybody, and I was helping on whatever needed to be done. And really that was the ethic that prevailed in SNCC. You did whatever had to be done. You know, there was no hierarchy in the organization. And so I had a very easy transition. The day came when Jim Foreman, who was the executive secretary of SNCC, and who was a little bit older than everybody else. He'd been a teacher in Chicago, sophisticated, strategically smart, person, but also very affectionate. And the day came when he said, "Mary, let's have a chat." And so I sat down with him next to his desk. It was probably donated. And he said, "Well, would you be willing to work on communications?" I mean, I didn't have that much to offer, to tell you the truth. I could read, I could write. I guess that's why he thought I might be okay in communications. He would sometimes sweep the floor of the office. So, I mean, I could have done that too if he had asked me, but he didn't ask me to do that. He asked if I would like to work in communications, and he would have had to clear that with Julian. That is not something that Jim would have done without Julian having mulled that over and bought into it. The room in which we worked was tiny. It was about 1/3 less than the size of the room that we're sitting in now. It had 2 desks, 2 manual typewriters, and 2 telephones. And then I had a box into which I put absolutely everything that I wrote. So when I finished typing something, took it out of the typewriter, and I put a copy in that box. And that later became the collection that is now at the Wisconsin State Historical Society. So that was the communications office. No other civil rights group had anything like this. It was imperative. We were working under conditions where the southern white newspapers and media, such as they were severely imbalanced and lopsided in their reportage of anything having to do with race, if they reported it at all. And in fact, it was the failure of the southern white news media to report simply what was happening that made it so important for us to have a communications office.
Dr. Bourne, let me ask you, as somebody who is observing this from a different perspective, do you agree with Mary's assessment that local media were not really tuned in to what was happening in Atlanta and then beyond Atlanta as well, that they just weren't getting the civil rights story?
Yes, I do agree. And in Atlanta was somewhat unique in that there was a black newspaper in Atlanta. And later I will become very good friends with one of their top reporters, Paul Delaney, who started there with the black newspaper in Atlanta and ended his career with the New York Times. And then the Atlanta Constitution, they walked an interesting line. There was a man called Ralph McGill, who was sort of a promoter of Atlanta, and he always tried to write sitting on the fence. He didn't want to repeat the sort of racist chants that you got from rural Georgia. On the other hand, he didn't want to be seen as easily pro-integration. And that's how it was. And one thing that they did, as Mary said, was just to ignore any black news. They covered nothing in the black community. And their argument is, well, it would all be covered in the Atlanta world. That was their justification. But really they were just playing to the racist sentiment in the society.
Mary, could you talk a little bit about what your perception was of the Atlanta news media once you got settled in? You're new to the region. There's a lot coming at you. Ralph McGill has this reputation, as Peter was saying, as this kind of forward-thinking progressive, but that wasn't necessarily the view that was shared by a lot of people at that time in the Atlanta movement. What was your take on the Constitution and Ralph McGill and just the way the Atlanta media was covering the story?
Well, the Atlanta newspapers had some individuals who were willing to go against the editorial policies of the newspapers. The newspapers were very wishy-washy, there's no question about it. They were not taking any heroic stands whatsoever. They believed in the First Amendment, sort of. But there were individuals who were willing to really let go of all of the platitudes and just do a good job of reportage. Those were the people that I had on my clipboard. I had a clipboard filled with the names and telephone numbers, the hot numbers for the key reporters, and these were the people that we really trusted. And they were international as well as Atlanta. But there's no question that the Atlanta media was walking down the middle of the road and was not a courageous force. Within the first few days of the assassination, the bodies of 5 black men turned up in the Natchez River. And one of my roles in communications was to call regularly all of our main offices in Mississippi while I was still in Atlanta. So this would have been November 1963 that I'm talking about. And with reports that there were bodies of 5 black men floating in the Natchez River, I also sensed a tremendous amount of fear on the part of the people in the offices that I was talking with, and anxiety. And I thought to myself, because I had developed this kind of relationship, as had Julian, we both had a relationship where we could contact a reporter and say, there's something you might want to be aware of. Although we were very guarded in the way that we used the credibility that we had built up, there were times when we would call and say, something's up and you might want to know about it. When I thought about this assignment, it was Nick von Hoffman that I thought about calling first, because he was tough. And he'd been writing for the Chicago Tribune, and he suffered no fools. And I told him about the corpses in the Natchez River, and I said, I sense that there's a great deal of fear in the local community from the people that I'm talking with. Would you by any chance be willing to go and see about this situation? Well, he called me after he got to Natchez, and he said, Mary, the fear is liquid, and it's everywhere. So he's a very brazen, unafraid, fearless reporter, and he was my first choice to contact. There were others in that category. Claude Sitten was definitely something that was let me say that again. Claude Sitten was definitely somebody that I felt that I could call and say, there's something that you need to know about. I think you ought to check this out. One of the very important capacities of Julian, one of his attributes, is the reason that we had that credibility. Because Julian, as a matter of his own personal strength, was inclined to understatement. And what he taught me is to always minimize, always underestimate, under no circumstances ever exaggerate. And I'm surprised today at how little people understand that, because people on social media are counting the number of people who like them and bragging about the number of likes they have. But for us, the situation was so extremely dangerous that the last thing that you wanted to do was ever to inflate a number or to speculate on anything. And I owe it entirely to Julian that he schooled me in this approach of always depreciating, underestimating, minimizing. Let the reporters go out and verify the numbers. Over time, this built up huge credibility for the communications office, because eventually some of the reporters would take whatever we called them with. There were many people on that clipboard for whom I could eventually go into print with. I could do that eventually with Claude Sitten. The figures that John Herbers published in the New York Times for the fatalities and atrocities at the end of Mississippi Freedom Summer, those were the figures that I had hammered out, and I include them in my book Freedom Song. He took his figures from me without attribution. We were not seeking attribution. That was another thing. Another dimension of Julian's modulated approach, very honed approach. We were not seeking credit. This is something that today's young people seem to have a completely antithetical approach to. We didn't want credit. We simply wanted the news to be reported so that atrocities would be known, so that deaths would be known. Among the reporters that we had confidence in, Fred Powledge was one in whom we had a great deal of trust. I remember that Paul Good of ABC was also very interested in what we were doing. Bill Miner of the New Orleans Times-Picayune. There are any number of them. So it was the individual reporter that Julian and I would seek out and develop a relationship with. And they knew that we were not seeking credit. We did not expect to see our names mentioned or even SNCC mentioned, although periodically there would be something just saying a spokesperson at the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee claims such and such, and they would go right into print with it.
Can you tell us how that would work if you were out somewhere trying to cover a story and work with people about that story, and Julian's back in Atlanta? How did the two of you work together to achieve your goal?
Yeah, all of SNCC, in a sense, was built on divisions of responsibility. And these were not written in job descriptions or anything like that. They were just worked out arrangements that worked from day to day. And in Danville, for example, I was dealing with reporters who were right there on the scene. So I was based in a church, in the church basement, and it was the movement church that was most active. Reporters would come and seek me out, and I would give them all the help that I could give them. I would refer them to this one or refer them to that one. I would tell them exactly what had happened. I'd give them counts. I'd go find out information for them. I'd help them with their writing. I'd answer questions. But I also had to be trying to get the Danville news out through the wire services, and that's where Julian would come in, because I could call him in Atlanta and say that 3 enormous fire hoses have just been snaked up onto the steps of the municipal building in preparation for the demonstration that is planned for tonight. And I believe that there will be no caution in the way that they're used. And that was exactly what happened in Danville, that these enormous fire hoses were used by an extremely petty city government against a little local movement that just wanted jobs in the police force, secretaries to be hired in the municipal building, desegregation of the public library. Instead, the officials of the library closed it down, and when they reopened it, there were no chairs in it. The demands were very, very modest, and yet the response was horrific. It was as bad as anything in Birmingham in 1963, and this is approximately the same period as the Birmingham Children's Crusade in April of 1963. So Julian and I worked very much in tandem, always. I would say that Julian wrote more easily than I wrote. It took more concentration for me to work out a draft, and I might have to go through many drafts. Julian just seemed to have a kind of nonchalance in the way that the words would pour from his fingers typing on the typewriter with the same kind of elegance that he presented personally. Whereas I might go through 1, 2, 3, 8 drafts or something before I got it ready. The other thing is that when I was first sent to Danville by Jim Foreman and Julian Bond, I didn't actually know how to write a news release yet, because I had started working with Julian, but I was still sort of a learner. And I was doing other things. You know, he sent me to Albany to write a report, a special report. I was taking affidavits somewhere else. So I was working on smaller reports and special publications. And then when Jim said, go handle communications in Danville, I said, but Jim, I don't really know how to write a press release yet. He said, you'll learn. This was very indicative of the attitude in SNCC. There was no time for elegant preparation. There was no time for laborious, detailed preparation. We really just had to move with the demands. Danville was very dangerous, actually. One day as I was at work in the church basement, one of the movement lawyers, Len Holt, black lawyer with the Congress of Racial Equality, whom I remember so well and so kindly, came in to see me and said, Mary, the grand jury has been seated and they're planning to indict you for acts of violence and war. This is actually a codicil language that came after the Nat Turner uprising in Virginia, in which there were a number of slave owners who were killed. I believe it was not 1831, but my memory may not be accurate on that. It was approximately 1831 this was instituted. And that's what the grand jury was getting ready to indict me for. Now bear in mind this, I never walked in a single demonstration in Danville. I never was seen in public if I could avoid it. I'm on the phone and I'm on the typewriter. And I went back and forth between the black community. At night I was staying with a family. And we stayed at the end of a long bayou. There was a narrow road that went into the black community. And the police officers would trail us. They did something that I've never seen done anywhere else. They would follow us in front. In other words, they would put their cars in front of our cars so tight that any failure to put on a turn signal, or at the time, you put your left arm out for left and you put your arm up for right and you put your arm down for stop. So any failure to show a signal and their sirens would go on and you'd be arrested immediately, or 1 inch over the line and we would be arrested. But when they came to this road, on the bottom of which there were these very, very deep bayous alongside the Dan River. This is a textile manufacturing community, and the Dan River was part of the water source used for the manufacturing of textiles. But the black community had only one road to it. The police would peel off and not follow our cars into the black community. And I just mention that because it's a mistake to believe that there was anything natural or inherent about African Americans adopting the strategies and tactics of nonviolent action. This is something they had to learn. And there were any number of agents that were involved in that process. We had the Reverend Dr. James M. Lawson working with us in trainings. We had Bayard Rustin, great strategist, working with us periodically and preparing us and getting us ready for whatever needed to be done. And there were others who had assisted. Although I never worked with Glenn Smiley, I certainly heard a lot of stories about him. And there were individuals like Stoughton Lynd, who had studied Gandhi and the history of nonviolent action in the United States very deeply, and who understand about the theories and the methods. So it's a mistake to think that there was a foregone conclusion that the black community would be nonviolent. This was something that required translation and interpretation. And since I'm now working with Jim Lawson as director of the James Lawson Institute, and we are conducting periodic institutes where people can learn, study the historical technique of nonviolent struggle, I want to mention that because people look at the movement and they don't understand that individuals had to make a commitment, and based on understanding that you will not be able to invoke any reactions such as defection if you use any kind of violent terminology or any kind of violent action. There's a great deal of naivete about what was involved in black communities deciding that they would embark on a nonviolent approach for their localized campaign.
Peter, I want to come back to you for a minute. You're still in Atlanta in the early 1960s. Mary, who you do not know yet, is in Danville, Virginia, trial by fire. What were your observations on what was happening in Atlanta during that time? And during that time, did you continue your friendship with Julian and ever talk about things that were happening in and around the city, or talk about the work of SNCC?
I graduated from medical school in June of 1962, and I was offered a fellowship in the psychiatry department to study alcoholism in the Atlanta City jail. And it was a research project, and I was supposed to get out of it some understanding of why there were 50,000 arrests each year for public drunkenness in Atlanta. And by no means all of those were African Americans, but the majority were African Americans. And that led me to have a great deal of contact with the black community, particularly black churches that were concerned about alcoholism, with my friend that I mentioned earlier, Paul Delaney. Paul Delaney had been writing for the Atlanta World, and he criticized the poor treatment of African Americans in the Atlanta court system, and said how very poor it was and that there were no probation officers. And the judges in the court said, all right, if you feel that way, we'll hire you as the probation officer. So he went from being a journalist to being a probation officer. And so I worked very closely with him. And he was trained as a journalist, but also an activist. He was somewhat older than Julian and the others, the students, but he was extremely well plugged in the Atlanta black community. So I worked with him, I worked on alcoholism, and it just, I learned a great deal. It was only a year, but I understood the black community incredibly better at the end of that year than I did previously.
Well, I'd like to actually talk a little bit. We've mentioned the Atlanta Daily World, we've mentioned the Atlanta Inquirer, two very different publications.
Yes.
Did you and Julian work much with the black press, not just in Atlanta, but when you were doing the work that you did you ever work with the Chicago Defender or the Pittsburgh papers or the New York papers, very prominent African American newspapers? How was your relationship with them compared to the relationship you had with the mainstream white media?
Well, this is a slightly complicated answer, and it also depends on what time, where in the chronology you are in answering this question.
We can be wherever you want to be.
Well, I would say this, that Jet magazine was there all the time. It was on the phone. It was walking in and out of the office. It was very, very, very close. And Jet was Johnny on the spot all the time. They had other sources, obviously, besides us. But with regard to the other newspapers, and we were dealing with them. What I remember in particular is making phone calls to offer them actualities that we had taped by telephone and calling a local movement or a local campaign office. So that, let us say that something had happened in Little Rock, Arkansas. Either Julian or I would get on the phone to somebody in the Little Rock office and ask them what had happened. They would come on the phone and they would say exactly what had happened. And then we would make what it's called in the news industry an actuality, meaning it's a literal, actual report from the scene, and phone and offer those. So we would offer those to the Gary newspaper, the Amsterdam News, the all of the classic black newspapers, the black-owned newspapers that were so important in bringing the news from India of what was happening in the independence struggles, by the way, I should mention. So there was a kind of avid reportage of what was going on, what Gandhi was doing. He was referred to as the little brown man, but there was coming into black homes through the black newspapers was constant reporting of the struggles in India, and that was part of the background, part of the backdrop to the decisions that were made in the black community to pursue these matters with nonviolent struggle.
Why do you think that so many white mainstream media, particularly newspapers in the South, were reluctant to cover this story and reluctant to kind of come on board with where you were? You've mentioned a few reporters, but I think it's useful for people to know that if you were living in Atlanta or a town somewhere near Atlanta or Nashville, Charlotte, Birmingham, if you were white, you really didn't have much of an idea what was going on in the movement. And a lot of people who will be watching this don't know why, when it was such a huge story. Is there anything that you can tell us from your perspective then about why the papers were so reluctant to cover this story, at least at that time in 1963, 1964?
This is a very difficult question for me because it was not part of my job to try to make breakthroughs. What Julian and I concocted, and to my recollection, this is something that he and I figured out ourselves, is what we needed to do was to find a way to work through UPI and AP, United Press International and Associated Press wire services. The reasoning being that if we could get something going from Atlanta to Portland, Oregon, or Seattle, or to Boston, Massachusetts, in the course of going to those places, it would have to go through the ticker tape machines all over the country. So if we wanted to get all of AP and all of UPI carrying a story of something that had happened, what we needed to do was to prompt a request to come in from a distant subscriber to the news service. We worked this out in conjunction with the Friends of SNCC program. And what we would do is contact the local Friends of SNCC program. We had Friends of SNCC organizations in Princeton, New York, Chicago, Boston, Portland, Seattle, many, many cities across the United States. And they were basically support groups, fundraising. Later they would help in the recruitment for Mississippi Freedom Summer 1964. But we would contact them and say that there's a story, or I have a report, or I would contact them and say, I've just had a phone call from Hattiesburg, Mississippi, to the effect that such and such, who is from Chicago, was arrested. Would you please call AP and find out if they're carrying anything on the arrest of the Chicagoan? Call AP in Chicago. Ask, do they have anything on this? Well, of course there would be nothing, because they're languishing in the jails. So part of what Julian and I were doing was following up when we found out that someone who was from outside the South was arrested. That meant that we would be able to activate this national network of the wire services if we could activate the Friends of SNCC group, and if we could also get them to go to the wire services and saying someone from Newark, New Jersey is being held in a jail. This was a very complicated and I think sophisticated, advanced approach that we used. But it was born from the circumstances, which were that we really couldn't trust the white Southern media. I myself don't know whether this was a business decision or whether this was just sheer systemic racism. I don't think that I would have any way of knowing that. And I haven't done the research to go back to find out, although I am in the process of interviewing someone from the Jackson Clarion Ledger now for a book that I'm working on Mississippi. But there's no question about it. Black deaths or atrocities against black people were not considered newsworthy. The reporters told Julie and me this. They told us, these are not newsworthy. We can't get a story published to this effect. Our editors won't run it. They knew what they could run and what they could not. It's devastatingly widespread. It's part of our national problem that we have done such a poor job of confronting historical atrocities of the past and making some form of atonement or apology for them.
I do think with the Atlanta Constitution and Journal, loss of advertising revenue was a really important consideration. And also, although it's hard to correlate it, I think they were very worried about a drop in circulation if they broke the traditional taboos. In fact, they didn't lose circulation when they started to cover black news. But I know with the sit-ins at Rich's department store, there was a great deal of discussion between the board members of Rich's and the Atlanta Constitution as to how it should be covered. And Rich's preferred that it just not be covered at all because they thought that it would just look bad. And then the people at the newspaper didn't want to go against what Rich's wanted because Rich's would stop advertising with them. So it was a complicated thing, I think, actually, by the early 60s, driven almost exclusively by commercial concerns and not so much about pure racism.
It's very likely that there was a great deal of concealed injustice in the ownership of the Southern news media. Whatever it was, they did not act as if their job was to get out the news. They acted more as a pacification, an interpretation of what was going on in such a way that the white community would not be too alarmed or too disturbed. In point of fact, it would have been much better if they had taken on their First Amendment responsibilities and actually reported the news. So we were doing many, many things. You need to be aware of the fact that we had 12 professional photographers strung across the South. When I say we, I mean Julian and I, then in the communications shop. And part of that began with Dorothy Miller Zellner, who was doing the work that I would be doing before me, and with Julian. So this took years actually to develop. But by 1964, we had 12 professional photographers spread across the South. So we had photography, high-class professional photographs that were available that Julian and I could use helpfully in abetting the getting out of the news. We were publishing a weekly newspaper called The Student Voice. It went out by snail mail, to be sure, but it went out, and it went out to anybody who gave even $1 to SNCC would get on the Student Voice subscription list. We began eventually to use photographs in our news releases. So instead of just being mimeographed and your hands stank for a week afterwards, instead of just being mimeographed, we now had photographs on the news, on the press releases. But we were also issuing special reports. We were compiling the reports from the wide area telephone service every day. It was called the Watts Line, Wide Area Telephone Service. This was a real advantage when Jim Foreman got it, because what SNCC did was to pay a monthly fee for SNCC being able to talk all that it wanted per month across all of its telephones. Before that, when it was on a toll basis, we had to be more scrupulous in when we called and how long we talked. But with the Watts line, wide area telephone service, we could spend as much time as was needed. So, you type much type as you had to do to get all the information. Then we were calling with the radio actualities, and actualities offered to other news media who just wanted to hear it from the spoken word. And a lot of those were to the black press, which was very eager to have that material. And then we were also doing affidavits, so just to have a formally scrupulous report of an atrocity or something terrible that had happened. Now, with Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964, I was asked by Jim Foreman and Julian to go to Jackson and be based at the Council of Federated Organizations, which was an umbrella that had been created for pooling the efforts of all of the civil rights groups to have a presence under that umbrella. In point of fact, the groups were not equals by any means. I mean, SNCC was far and away the largest of the civil rights groups at that time. And we had 122 staff members based in Mississippi. But what we wanted was the presence of the moral presence of all the groups, so that it included the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and CORE and other groups. They were all involved. Now, from COFO, we would work to get out to be present in local communities when there were decisions being made, because our office became more and more less devoted to the who, what, why, and where, and more devoted to filling in the dotted lines of what was happening and had been happening, and what were the causes of injustice and background. And by then we had a research shop headed by Jack Minnis, political scientist from Louisiana State University, who had joined us. So we were putting out more and more sophisticated materials, including analyses. With Mississippi Freedom Summer, on the first day of the project in June 1964, 3 young workers who had gone out to investigate a firebombing of the Mount Zion Methodist Church in Neshoba County disappeared. Part of the protocol under which I worked, and Julian did too, I mean, we developed this protocol together, was to call every jail in the area, to phone every jail in the area on the Watts line, and to inquire as to whether this one, and this one were being held in their jail. So on that day, June 21 or June 12, I'm not sure. We might have to do a little sentence later on and establish that not from memory. On that day, I got on the phone on June 21, 1964, I did what I was meant to do, and Julian was meant to do, which is to call every jail in the area of where there had been an atrocity or there was something that had happened to somebody, or in this case, disappearance of Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman. James Chaney was a local young man. Andrew Goodman was a volunteer who had just arrived from the training program at the Oxford College for Women in Ohio. He had literally just gotten off the bus. And Mickey Schwerner was already on hand working for the Congress of Racial Equality. I called all of the jails in a 9-county area asking if they were holding James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, or Michael Schwerner, one of which would have been Neshoba County. And I believe it was Cecil Price, the deputy sheriff, who denied to me that they were holding them. It later became very clear they were holding them, and in fact he was about ready to pass them on, to convey them over to their killers in the Ku Klux Klan, or affiliated with the Ku Klux Klan. So what we were doing, was multi-purpose, multi-function. Everything from calling jails to getting out more and more sophisticated news reports, getting out more and more sophisticated special reports, offering actualities with live voices from the local movement, and then working with the elite of the National News Corps, who were these individuals who were individuals of conscience. They were making fights with their editors to get those stories carried. None of them was having an easy time of it. Some had earned enough credibility that just their filing would be enough. Claude Sitten definitely fell in that category. But others were still having to make fights, and they would often tell us about it. This is why I have such an awareness of the fact that the Southern news media considered black atrocities or black deaths to be not newsworthy, is because they would tell us how their editors thought. How else would I know that? It's not my supposition. It's not my opinion. It's what I was told by stalwart, fearless exceptions who were ready to work hard to get something broken in the news.
How did you and Julian find working with the Kennedy administration?
Well, for example, on June 21st, 1964, when the three young men, Mickey Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman, disappeared, when this occurred, I was the one who typed the news release that went out that night. It's online now from the Wisconsin State Historical Society. And at around midnight, according to my notes, I called John Doerr of the Justice Department. We had a very good relationship with John Doerr. We respected him. We admired him. I have no emotional bad memory of that conversation with him. I would have called him Mr. Doerr. Remember, I'm very young. He was Mr. Doerr of the Justice Department, and I'm an official spokesperson. And I told him what had happened. And so there were individuals in the Kennedy administration that in the Lyndon Johnson administration there wasn't that much difference between the Kennedy and Johnson administration. So the Kennedy administration was not a monolith, first of all. However, I would say that it's quite important to remember that the Kennedy family had a kind of Harvard liberalism. They did not really know black families. So I think that it's very important to remember where they were from, and the fact that their take was the take of an elite family under elite circumstances, looking at a people that they did not know and were not intimate with. There was a great deal of intimacy in the South. Some of it was brutal and cruel, but not all of it. But the other thing that I remember the historian Harvard Sitkoff talking to me, and I quote him in Freedom Song, as a matter of fact, where he said, the Kennedy posture was one of minimalism. Just do as little as you possibly can. And I think that there was some truth to that, because there was not a great deal of energy or muscle from that family until Bobby, in his final days, was free and operating on his own. But up until then, I think that Harvard Sitkoff had it right. It was a minimalist policy that seemed to pervade everything. Well, I find it very difficult to say that we worked with the FBI. I think that this is the wrong verb. In the protocols that Julian and I worked out for what we did every day, if something had happened that constituted a federal infraction, calling the FBI was part of what we were meant to do. But they were distant and cold. Moreover, I believed that there was complete collusion between the FBI and the law officers and vigilante groups and terror organizations that were all working together hand in glove. This was particularly true in Mississippi. But I remember when I was working in Atlanta with Miss Ella Baker, I would come downstairs from 31 Exchange Place, I think it was, and there would be men, great big, abdomens and smoking cigars and, spitting tobacco and so on, and hats pulled down, just standing across the street from 31 Exchange Place, watching who was coming out and sometimes taking photographs. Everybody around me said they were the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, which worked hand in glove with the FBI. I assumed that since I had not arrived in Georgia for very long, they were right. I never engaged them. Although I could be mischievous, there were times when I called and gave false reports just to see if there would be any reaction. I once called the Atlanta police using the name of a New England transcendentalist, Margaret Fuller. I said, "This is Margaret Fuller calling, and there is a demonstration at such and such street and such street. Is the Atlanta police force aware of this? Are you aware of this?" And then I went to that place and I watched to see if they came, and they did. So I don't think I've ever talked about this before, but I did that once to find out whether they paid any attention to anything that was going on, because we couldn't discern any effectiveness. We couldn't discern any intervention. We couldn't discern any mediation, any concern for getting an accurate record. We couldn't discern any difference that was being made by the FBI. That's the long and the short of it.
So they were not a friendly witness.
Not in our experience. Now that doesn't pertain to our ability to reach Mr. Dorr. But then he was at a very senior level, and he had the authority to be involved in ways other than a local agent would have had.
Was there anyone else in particular, John Dorr, who's often cited by by a lot of people, the way you've spoken of him? Was there anybody else within the administration that you found that you could go to that was a resource, a helpful person, an ear that would try to bring to they were able to, they were hearing what you were saying and they were trying to be helpful? Is there anybody that you remember being able to do that for you?
No. I don't remember anything like that whatsoever. I also remember the Jackson Clarion Ledger. I remember thinking to myself that it should be printed in red, like dripping blood, because it just seems so aligned with the forces of no change, just oppose any change whatsoever. No. I can't say that I remember everything, but I certainly don't remember that.
In retrospect, I was still quite young. I was just before my 18th birthday, and I was still in the process of learning the difference between being an adolescent and being an adult. My world initially was very much the world of Emory and my academic pursuits, and I was, very struck by the difference between academic institutions in the UK and academic institutions in the US. a lot of the students at that time at Emory were, if not from Georgia, from the South. And things that struck me and appalled me were just simple things like students would be in the library with their feet on the tables in the library, and they would stick their chewing gum under the edge of the tables. And you know, I had used to students who were more refined than that. The whole thing was kind of a cultural shock. The race issue, you could address it or not address it. I mean, it was very easy to just ignore it and just go about your life, and it wasn't my problem. I mean, that could have been my attitude, and certainly for the first year that I was there when I was still an undergraduate. As I say, I essentially met no black people because there was no occasion where I would ever be exposed to black people. I didn't, you know, from in the beginning, it was hard for me to distinguish between the South and America more largely. And my assumption was that everything I saw in the South or upset me in the South was the same all over America. And, you know, I learned that most of that was not in fact true. After I graduated from medical school and I'd spent a year as a fellow working in the city jail, I had to go somewhere to do a regular internship. And I decided to apply to the hospital, the main city hospital in Seattle, in part because it was as far away from Atlanta as possible, in addition to which it was at the time one of the best internships in the country, so I had a sort of academic motivation. But I then was quite struck by how incredibly different Seattle was than Atlanta, and how different the Northwest was from the South. And it's kind of interesting. The South grows on you. The things that shocked me during my early years in Atlanta, I have nostalgia and affection for now. You know, part of it is that over time I moved into sort of an involvement with the establishment in Atlanta. I met this fellow and convinced him to run for president. So, you know, it was a different experience. I see people absolutely appalled with Jeff Sessions as Attorney General. And many of the things he's done, I think, are absolutely appalling. But I know people like that. They're all over the South, the Jeff Sessionses. And at one level, they're elegant and charming and patrician, even though they may be as racist as can be. And for people to get really upset about Jeff Sessions, I find it difficult to get into that because I've just known those people all of my adult life. So you take them knowing what they are. I mean, it's all of my experiences after I came to the US. I suppose there was, after the first year, after I got to know people like Julian, and there were a lot of other people. I mean, there were the black community in Atlanta was far more sophisticated than the white community in Atlanta, even though the white people were incredibly self-assured and arrogant and thought they just knew all about everything. But there was Maynard Jackson, who became mayor of Atlanta. He had a sister who was a very distinguished opera singer. She had great acclaim everywhere, but not in Atlanta. Jesse Norman, who actually was from Augusta, not Atlanta, was a world-acclaimed singer. White Atlanta didn't produce people like that, and yet, you know, they would go to the Piedmont Driving Club, which was the most incredible organization of self-appointed ignoramuses that you could possibly imagine. And it was sort of geared to perpetuating memories of the old South. But these people knew nothing about the rest of the world. They hadn't been outside of Georgia, outside of Atlanta, and their view of the world was not so much British, just ignorant and uninformed. And I thought, you this ignorant and uninformed, how can you be so arrogant? So that's what struck me. And I didn't put it in my book on Carter, but Carter told me incredible stories about, firstly, when he was running for governor, and then secondly, when he was running for president, how badly he was treated by the Atlanta establishment. You know, they didn't take him seriously. They didn't think he was going anywhere, and he was from South Georgia, and so they just treated him appallingly.
I was not involved in his Georgia bid. Of course, we all were participants in it. I mean, there was a certain amount of discussion within SNCC staff about whether this was a good idea or not. Some people liked it very much because there was a very strong debate as to whether we should move toward actually dealing with the power structures and actually beginning to influence directly the institutions and organs of power in the country. Others thought that there should be more of the approach that we had been taking. The approach that we had been taking involved a great deal of what Gandhi had called the constructive program, in which essentially when a people is under oppression, they withdraw themselves from the powers that have created that oppression, and they begin, even though they're still living in the old order, they begin creating the new order by building institutions that will someday serve them. It's a very, very potent concept. This is a lot of what we did in Mississippi, although no one has written to interpret it yet. I'm working up toward that. Stoughton Lynd had studied this material, and it was through Stoughton Lynd, who was very influential with the freedom schools, that we began to articulate and to work on that. So the freedom schools pulled the children out of, you know, pathetically impoverished black schools, and for that summer gave them a view of history, which was recognizing the enormity of the contribution made to the building of the United States of America by African people. I can't think of any people who have given more to the building of this country than Africans. And they are not the only ones, of course, but they are among the great builders and creators of this country. So they got history as it ought to have been taught to them. And there were other ways in which we did this too. Martin Luther King considered voter registration to be part of the constructive program. The building of cooperatives, the development of credit unions, the development of an alternative political party, the development of alternative or parallel institutions is a big part of the constructive program. And so this was really quite significant situation that was underway. And within SNCC, there was a big debate as to whether or not to seek political office or to continue operating as if you were solely on the outside, a sort of inside versus outside. So it was a big debate issue. Everybody had an opinion, but I was not involved. I didn't have any responsibility. Then going on to Julian's legacy, I think that there are a number of really important things that we need to highlight here. One is the recognition that he was very young and yet was able to be enormously influential because of his native gifts, the extraordinary talents that he possessed in his own mind, his own ability to speak, his ability to articulate, his ability to write, which was quite extraordinary. But I think it's a reminder to young people that at a very, very early age, you can make a demonstrative difference. And you should not in any way be intimidated by youth. It's an asset. You don't know how big the obstacles are. You're not aware of all the hindrances, all the blockages that lie ahead, all of the forms of opposition. Fine. Use that as a protective sort of tent around you that allows you to do that work. You don't want to be aware of too many of the obstacles because it's too daunting. Another thing I think to remember is that when you involve yourself in a justice effort, such as the freedom movement in the United States, which is what we called it, by the way. Even now when I hear the term civil rights, I think of lawyers going into courthouses. I don't think about the extraordinary, marvelous, magnanimous, generous Black people with whom I lived and worked for 4 years. The term freedom movement was much closer to what we were aiming for, and that's what we called the movement internally. Since we've done such a bad job on historiography and getting the news out as to what the movement was like, so far I don't hold out much hope that this is ever going to be recognized. But I do think that with Julian, that had he lived, he would have, until his very last day, have still been working on the freedom movement. And I think that's one of the big aspects of his legacy that we should be aware of. His understanding that it was prudent to understate rather than to ever overstate is, it seems to me, one of the biggest and most profound lessons that today's generations can take from studying the movement. I think that it is imperative that people realize that how you talk, the language that you use, how you articulate your goals, the articulation of claims and demands, these are all much more important than walking on a demonstration. I myself am not interested in protest, and I am not interested in witness. Don't ask me for help on sheer protest. Don't ask me for help on sheer witness. It's not enough. We know a great deal now about how nonviolent action works that we did not know during the days of the movement. We understand it because a great deal of research has been done by a number of scholars all over the world. We now understand the kind of power. This is a distinct form of power, distinctive from other forms of power, and we know a lot more about it. But we need to continue working on one of Julian's real contributions, which is an understanding that the articulation and expression, the choice of words, the way that you talk about what it is that you're seeking, may be as important as any quote-unquote action that you would ever take. I would highlight that as one of the major and possibly unique contributions that he made to the movement, and certainly it has shaped my life, the way that I speak, the way I write, the way I handle anything. Speaking of which, we have now got so much nonviolent action in the United States, most of it ineffective because of the inability to discern what the claims are, what the demands are that are being asked. So there's no conveyance of actionable requests that would allow a bench sitter or an onlooker or an observer to say, oh, that's right, I'd like to be involved. We have marches, huge, grandiose marches. Everybody's carrying a different sign or no sign at all, or the sign that they're carrying bears no claim, no demand. I think that this is a very big mistake. I would also say that we need to do something, and this is something that I've talked with Jim Lawson about a great deal. We need to pay more attention to the preamble of the Declaration of Independence because it articulates the consent of the population, the consent of the people. This is basically how nonviolent action works. It withdraws the consent of the people. It non-cooperates. It denies obedience. And one of the discernments that Gandhi had made as early as 1905, while he was still working in South Africa, was that no system can stand if the people cease to obey it. So Julian, because he was so articulate and so elegant in his ability to express ideas and write ideas, I think stands as a very wonderful exemplar for today's movements and tomorrow's movements and today's campaigns and tomorrow's campaigns, of the importance of how you articulate and express what it is that you're seeking. And by the way, I would say that based on my own study of movements all over the years, which I've now been doing for decades, and the books that I've written on varieties of struggles in parts of the world, and my collaboration with the New York Times on a reference book on the former Eastern Bloc of the Soviet Union and the national nonviolent revolutions that brought about an end to the Cold War, in which they played a defining role. It's very, very important to be able to articulate and to say, this is what we're fighting for, and to have it be explicable, understandable, and something that others will want to help and join in.
Peter, do you have any final thoughts?
Yes. So I think, he lived an extraordinary life, was a wonderful model for lots of other people.